Dear ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here with you this afternoon and very honored to introduce our next speaker, former United States Secretary of State, Madeleine K. Albright. She is one of the most influential leaders of our time and a trailblazer for women not only in the United States, but across the world. Madeleine Albright was the first woman ever to become the US Secretary of State, and she showed the world what happens when women can take their rightful place at the decision-making table. With the courage and determination that characterized her, she shaped US foreign policy while advocating for human rights and for the plight of those living under repression and tyranny. I and my fellow Kosovars are a living proof of her dedication to standing up against injustice and authoritarianism and to offering hope to millions of people for a peaceful and prosperous life. 20 years ago, my country, Kosovo, was experiencing a terrible war that had torn the fabric of our society and was threatening our very existence. Secretary Albright spearheaded diplomatic efforts that led to NATO intervention in Kosovo, which ended the war, saved 2 million people from ethnic cleansing, and paved the way for peace, freedom, and democracy. She has touched the lives of so many of us, and we will always be grateful for her principled leadership. As the first woman president of Kosovo and the first in the Southeast Europe, I looked up to Secretary Albright for inspiration. Her example guided my work to advocate equal opportunities, to uphold freedom and liberty, and to strengthen democratic institutions in my own country. She continues to be a powerful source of inspiration for me and countless individuals around the world who strive to have a positive impact and build a better future. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Secretary Albright.
Well, Secretary Albright, we are absolutely thrilled to have you with us today. We all know that you're an extraordinary leader in the area of global affairs and foreign policy, but I know personally you're an extraordinary advocate for women's leadership, women's political participation. You chair the National Endowment for Democracy, and maybe you can explain what that is when you respond. But you really put your own power and your own experience to bat to promote women's leadership. And maybe you could tell us how you do that and why you do that.
Well, Ambassador Verveer, we do that to each other. I'm delighted to be here and to have the opportunity to talk about all this. And I have to say that it is clear to me that when women are out there and we're all working hard, we do it together, not against each other. And I think that is a very important part. I am so grateful for all the things that happened, and I know I'm not supposed to say I was lucky, but basically I did manage to have my credentials together at a time that people were looking for the one woman. And so I was able to kind of parlay one thing to another. But I have to say that one of the best things, and you and I will agree on this, is that we had an opportunity to work for and with the Clintons, who believed in the fact that women should be able to pursue careers and have a chance to show what we can do together. So I'm very grateful to them.
And what is it that you do at NDI to promote women's political participation?
Well, let me explain a little bit. Actually, what is interesting, we're about to celebrate our 35th anniversary. What happened was President Reagan was in London speaking at Parliament, and he was saying that democracies were not real good about explaining themselves vis-a-vis communism. So he came back to the United States and he started the Endowment for Democracy, which has 4 institutes, Democrats and Republicans, business and labor. And I was the original vice chair, democratically put into place by fiat. But what happened is we were trying to really figure out what we needed to do. And one of the things that we have concentrated on more than anything else is how to support women candidates in all over the world. And we are working on that now in a number of countries, explaining how the nuts and bolts of democracy work and how societies are better off when women are politically empowered. I have to say that when I became secretary, I was the first one to put women's issues central to American foreign policy, and not just because I'm a feminist, but I do believe that societies are better off when women are economically and politically empowered, and then Secretary Clinton took it to a whole other level, but that was the part of it. Something that we're doing now with the United Nations is to explain that even when we're able to support women, there still is a lot of harassment and very dangerous. And so with the UN, we have started something called Not the Cost, is to really show that we need to support women as they are being harassed for running for office. And so it's not just a matter of getting people to run, but to be supportive, and it does make a huge difference, and NDI is very much the center of that.
You know, it really is difficult for women in politics, and I remember a woman in Africa saying to me, you know, she wanted to run for the parliament, and she said, they say to you, well, if you have a family, why aren't you with the family? And if you don't have a family, there's something wrong with you.
Right.
So she said, either way, you can't win. But when you were ambassador to the United Nations for the United States, and I know that when you arrived at the UN, there weren't too many female ambassadors. But being that you were representing the United States, you were in a very strong position of leadership. How did you support the few other women ambassadors?
Well, let me just say, there were 183 countries at the UN when I was there. And it was one of the first times I didn't have to cook lunch myself. So I asked my assistant to invite the other women to the residence so that I could meet them. And I get there, and there's 6 other women out of 183. There was Canada, Philippines, Kazakhstan, Trinidad, Tobago, Jamaica, Liechtenstein, and me.
All these years later,
right.
she remembers.
Yeah. So what happened was, being the American, I created a caucus, and we called ourselves the G7. And we agreed that we would always stay in touch and take each other's telephone calls. So what happened, all of a sudden, one of the male ambassadors at the UN said, why would you be talking to Liechtenstein? And I said, well, have yourself replaced by a woman, and I'll be very happy to take your call whenever you want. But the thing that we did become very good friends and supported each other in so many ways. But the interesting part is what we were able to do, because at that stage we were dealing with the issues in Bosnia, where women were being terrorized and raped and made into refugees, and so we lobbied to get women judges on the War Crimes Tribunal, and we did manage to get 2 women judges. Later, we did a lot of things to do with HIV and AIDS, and really did try to use our power as the G7. Now there are many more women, and also women ambassadors in Washington, but never enough, and women foreign ministers. But I think that we really need to keep pursuing that. By the way, I'm going to tell one other story about the UN. I think many people have heard me on this subject, and I think we've all had this experience. You're in a meeting, you're the only woman in the room, and you decide that you're going to say something, and then you think, well, everybody will think it's stupid, so I won't say it, and then some man says it, and everybody thinks it's brilliant, and you're really mad at yourself. And so that happened to me early in my government career before the Clinton administration. And then I taught at Georgetown, and I tried to explain to my students that everybody had to learn to interrupt. Nobody was going to raise their hands in class. My classes are a bit of a zoo, but I really have said they have to do that. But the story is the following. I get to the United Nations. I am the only woman on the Security Council, and most of the meetings don't take place in that fancy room, but in a room in the back. And I sit down, and people start talking about a subject, and I thought, oh, well, I don't know, I won't talk today until I figure out if they like me or not. And then I saw the sign in front of me, it said United States. And I thought, if I don't speak today, the voice of the United States will not be heard, and you've got to speak.
So, speaking of that, I wonder when you assumed the position as the first female head of the State Department, our foreign minister around the world, whether you felt it was any kind of a super responsibility in a way, beyond the responsibility of any Secretary of State, but being the first woman. Was that extra pressure? Was it?
Well, first of all, I didn't believe I'd ever be Secretary of State. What happened was Warren Christopher, who'd been Secretary of State, made clear he was going to not be there for a second term. And so the period of the great mentioning started happening. And my name was out there, and somebody said, well, a woman couldn't be Secretary of State because Arab countries would not deal with an American woman. And so what happened was the Arab ambassadors at the UN got together and they put out a statement saying, we've had no problems dealing with Ambassador Albright. We wouldn't have any problems with Secretary Albright. Then what happened, somebody at the White House, and I never want to know who, said, yeah, Madeleine's on the list, but she's second tier. And so
that was the quote in the Washington Post.
It was the quote in the Post. So I never thought I'd get to be Secretary of State, and I was thrilled to be. And I know as a fact that the only reason I was because of Hillary. And the reason I know that is because President Clinton said so publicly when we were abroad one time. We had this shtick, we often travel together, and I would introduce her and she would introduce him. And he actually said that during this period of the great mentioning, Hillary would come to him and say, why wouldn't you name Madeleine? She's closest to your views and expresses them better than anybody else. So, and besides, it would make your mother happy. So that is how it happened. But partially, and I'm not just saying this because I'm sitting with you and Hillary's coming on, is that the partnership that we all had and the support that we had for each other, I think, made a very, very big difference. The thing that happened, one of my first trips actually was to the Gulf Cooperation Council meeting. It was in Kuwait, and I'm sitting there with the other foreign ministers, and they end up by saying, this was a great meeting. I said, well, perhaps you've noticed I'm not dressed exactly as my predecessors have been, and thank you very much. You've been very kind to me, and next time we'll talk about women's rights. And we did. And I did feel that I was representing a great country and that I had a huge opportunity to show that we were able to do what we had to do. I did work hard, and I did believe that I had to deliver, and I think there were advantages to it. But there was always the issue of how you go to a country and start a conversation and say what you have to, which mostly what you have to has to do with human rights and women's rights. So I'd be somewhere and I'd be nice and charming as best I could, and all of a sudden I'd say, I've come a long way, so I must be frank. And so I really told it like it is. But there was a responsibility about being the first woman, there's no question.
So you then succeeded to lead the way for two other women to be named Secretary of State in fairly short order, given a 20-year span. And it was certainly a trailblazing recognition of the role that you started and then others followed. And I understand, and maybe you could tell us if this is true, that your granddaughter was hearing you one night opine about this great role that you had played. And
So,
was she impressed?
No. What happened was my granddaughter, about 8 years ago, when she was 7, said to her mother, "So what's the big deal about Grandma Maddie being Secretary of State? Only girls are Secretary of State." And so in her lifetime, there had been Condi and Hillary, you know. And since then, actually, I have said there are some little boys out there who have been impressed by the fact that a man can be Secretary of State, sort of.
We've really achieved something when we don't have to comment on the firsts
Right.
anymore,
Yeah.
when it can become normal. We're talking here a lot today about technology and innovation. Have you experienced the importance of technology in terms of advancing the kinds of things that you've been working on, particularly for women?
No question. It has made a huge difference, and I have been very interested in my role, first with the National Democratic Institute, about how democratizing technology really can be or should be in terms of allowing information to people and really connecting people in many ways. I do think, and I talk about this all the time, is that technology has made it possible. I sometimes talk about the woman Kenyan farmer who no longer has to walk miles to pay her bills. She can do it with her phone, which has changed the possibilities of her life, not only with her family, but the possibilities of having employment of a variety of different kinds. And I think it really has made a difference. And also, in terms of women being able to create businesses, whether it's in India or the Middle East, and a lot of that does have to do with technology. There are upsides and downsides to technology, and one of the things I've talked about is, and this speaks to the larger things that are going on in the world, there are two mega trends out there. One is globalization, and the other is technology. They both have positive and downsides to them. So on globalization, I think most of us are beneficiaries of it, but it's faceless. And so people do want to know what their identities are. We all want to know ethnic, religious, linguistic, and that's patriotic. But if my identity hates your identity, it's very dangerous, and nationalism and hyper-nationalism is very, very dangerous. The other is technology, which is positive for all the reasons that we've already spoken about, but it also has a downside. It has disaggregated voices, and I sometimes talk about Egypt on this, is that people were summoned to Tahrir Square by social media. The issue is that they were all in their kind of echo chambers and only listened to what they already knew. And God forbid I should say this, but I think the elections in Egypt were held too soon. And so the Muslim Brotherhood was organized, the people in Tahrir Square were not, and the Muslim Brotherhood wins, and there were results from that. And so I think we need to understand the positives and negatives of technology. And by the way, I use this line fairly frequently, and I always say it's completely plagiarized from Silicon Valley, but it explains so well what is going on. People are talking to their governments on 21st century technology. The governments listen to them on 20th century technology and provide 19th century responses.
Wow.
So there's no faith in institutions. So there's a lot. And then I've just been at some seminars on artificial intelligence. I do think that we have not fully understood the impact of technology on all our economies, and we need to grasp what artificial intelligence is going to do even more, and how we deal with that as societies.
Well, and I know one of the things troubling about AI is who's doing the inputting, and where is the presence of women in this field, because what's going to come out is going to be essentially what was put in,
Right.
And you won't have the kind of predominant or even fair representation like is in this room.
I do think that some of us are not, by the way, my classmates are here, and I went to Wellesley at some time between the invention of the iPad and the discovery of fire. It should be true of you guys, too. But I do think that those of us, and by the way, so we talk an awful lot about millennials. I'm a perennial. And so what we have to do is figure out how to use the technology for the improvement of all of us.
But it truly has become even a big foreign policy issue in terms of it being used for radicalization by violent extremists, what's happened in terms, not just in the United States, but around Europe in terms of trying to change elections in a way that is truly interfering. So there's a lot that was not on the foreign policy years ago that is now risen
Very much
to the
so,
fore.
and I think people need to understand very well. You and I are both at Georgetown, and I think we have talked about what the curriculum for people that are in the larger field of international affairs has to be. And, it isn't just taking political science and history. What we have to do is understand health issues, issues to do with any kind of scientific thing. The world is not flat. And I think there are any aspects of that curriculum that we have to work on so that people really are prepared to have the discussions about AI and global warming and all the various aspects that are going on and the health issues. It's a growth industry and a field, and it needs women. I really believe that in terms of moving forward to get something that we want in the 21st century instead of the mess that's going on now. That, by the way, is a diplomatic term of art. Yeah.
You never stop. You're a force of nature, and it's hard to keep track of you at any given time. And we also knew you're an author, and everybody has gotten your book today called Fascism.
Thank you.
Fascism, a Warning. And I wonder if you could tell us why you wrote it, and maybe people will get into the book that much faster when they leave here.
Well, first of all, it has a very bland title, and some people think it's alarmist, and it's supposed to be. And the reason I wrote it, I actually was going to write it no matter who had gotten elected, because I felt very much that there were divisions in our society, created some by technology and not a full understanding of it. And I really speeded up the writing of it, even more after the election. And it is supposed to be, I decided it had to be historical. A lot of it is personal to me. I was born in Czechoslovakia in 1937, and the Nazis came in 1939. And a lot of people died as a result of fascism. As it turns out, I learned 38 members of my family did. And so I think so it was very personal, but also I thought it needed to be put into historic context. So I begin with Mussolini, and then Hitler, and then Franco, and then I talk about various places now in the world where I'm very worried by the dictatorial authoritarian leaders. The best quote in the book actually comes from Mussolini. And he said, "If you pluck a chicken one feather at a time, nobody notices." So there's a lot of feather plucking going on now, and you can't say those words too quickly together. But I do think there is a warning about the kinds of things that are going on. And I have, the part that I learned in writing the book is Mussolini, Hitler, and Franco came to power constitutionally. Mussolini, there were complications with party politics in the end of World War I, and King Emmanuel turned power over to him. Hitler, there were various issues going on in Germany, some as a result of the Versailles Treaty, some of financial, and the Weimar Republic wasn't strong. So von Hindenburg turned power over to Hitler. Then also in Spain, there was a weak government that folded, and the king there turned it over to Franco. The countries that I write about now, starting with Orban in Hungary and what's going on in Poland and in the Philippines with Duterte and Turkey with Erdogan and Chavez and Maduro in Venezuela, they were all elected. And I think it's only, and I do say that communism is also fascism. There they had revolutions, but all the other ones were people that were elected. And I think we need to understand what the conditions are that create this. You know, we're all familiar with that saying, see something, say something. I have added something to that, which is do something. We cannot normalize what is going on. And my to-do list really does include saying it is very important for there to be freedom of the press is not the enemy of the people, to have a judicial branch that is judicious, and to not think that our leaders can be above the law. And then I do think people need to run for office or support those that do. And then something that I think is actually hard to do, which is to talk with the people that we disagree with. I don't like the word tolerance because it's tolerate, put up with. I think we need to respect those views. I don't want to be in an echo chamber. I want to learn a lot. By the way, you should all be glad that you live here and not in Washington, because in Washington I listen to right-wing radio as I drive and do a little yelling and a few hand gestures, and so it's possible that I'm dangerous.
It may be the secret of longevity.
Well, whatever, you know. But then I don't think there's ever been a book or a speech that doesn't quote Robert Frost. So my quote is, the older I get, the younger are my teachers. And I think we need to support those young people that marched because of Parkland and all that. That's what we need to do.
Well, Madam Secretary, we're glad you're perennial,
Yeah.
and may you continue to lead. And you ended on a very optimistic note about youth, and we are about to have on this stage a representative of the coming generation, a young woman contributing to a better world. So let's welcome Hannah Oblak. And
Yeah.
thank you so much.
Milan, thank you.
Thank you so much.